The sun hung lazily in the clear blue sky that Saturday afternoon. It was one of those perfect spring days that seemed created specifically for outdoor activities. I had been working overtime for weeks, missing precious moments with my family. My son Brandon had been begging me to play catch with him, practice for his upcoming baseball season. Today was finally the day I could give him my undivided attention. Our front yard was not enormous, but it provided enough space for a casual game of catch. The grass was freshly cut, and the scent of spring flowers filled the air. Brandon bounced excitedly on the balls of his feet as I handed him his favorite glove. His smile was so bright it could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Do you think I could make the starting lineup this year, Dad?" Brandon asked, his voice full of hope as he caught my first gentle throw. "With the way you have been practicing? Absolutely," I replied, watching him wind up for his return throw. His technique had improved significantly since last season. The ball landed perfectly in my glove with a satisfying smack. We continued our game, laughing and chatting about school, friends, and his baseball dreams. These were the moments I lived for. The simple joy of connecting with my son, teaching him the game I had loved since my own childhood. Nothing else mattered in these precious minutes. I noticed her about 20 minutes into our game, the woman across the street. She had moved in approximately 6 months ago and rarely interacted with anyone in the neighborhood. I think I had waved to her once, receiving only a curt nod in return. Now she stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly across her chest, staring at us with undisguised disapproval. At first, I tried to ignore her, focusing instead on Brandon's improving throw. But her presence grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. She began muttering loudly enough for her voice to carry across to us, though I could not make out her exact words. Her body language spoke volumes, however. Every movement radiated hostility. "Dad, why is that lady looking at us like that?" Brandon asked, his enthusiasm visibly deflating under her stern gaze. "Do not worry about it, son. Just focus on your throw," I reassured him, though I could feel tension creeping into our previously relaxed atmosphere. Suddenly, her voice cut sharply through the air. "Excuse me, this is a violation of HOA rules. You are creating a public disturbance." I turned toward her, confused. We were simply playing catch. There was nothing disruptive about our activity, certainly nothing that warranted such an aggressive approach. "We are just playing catch in our own yard, ma'am," I called back politely, trying to diffuse whatever strange tension was building. Her face contorted with indignation. "There are regulations about recreational activities in front yards. This is exactly why we have an HOA, to prevent this kind of chaos." Chaos? We were tossing a baseball back and forth, not hosting a rock concert. I glanced around at the peaceful neighborhood, completely bewildered by her reaction. "I am going to have to report this," she announced, pulling out her phone dramatically. I assumed she meant she would file some sort of complaint with the homeowners association. Annoying, but nothing to be particularly concerned about. I turned back to Brandon, trying to recapture our earlier carefree mood. "Let us try a few more throws, then we can head inside for some lemonade," I suggested, attempting to salvage what remained of our afternoon. Brandon nodded, but the joy had drained from his face. He looked nervously across the street where the woman was speaking animatedly into her phone. I gave him an encouraging smile and held up my glove, signaling him to continue. What happened next left me completely stunned. Within minutes, a police cruiser turned slowly onto our street, lights flashing. Neighbors who had been going about their business stopped to observe the unfolding scene. The patrol car pulled up directly in front of our house. 2 officers stepped out, looking around with professional detachment. Brandon froze mid-throw, the ball clutched tightly in his hand. I stood immobile, unable to process what was happening. Had she actually called 911 for a father and son playing catch? "Is there a problem here, officers?" I asked as they approached, my voice steady despite the anger and embarrassment building inside me. "We received a call about a disturbance," one officer explained, eyeing the baseball gloves with obvious confusion. Across the street, Karen watched with undisguised satisfaction, phone still in hand, ready to document whatever happened next. My neighbors stared from their windows and porches. My son looked up at me, fear replacing the happiness that had been there just moments before. Something inside me hardened. This was not just an overreaction. This was a deliberate attack on my family's peace, on our right to enjoy our own property. As I politely explained the situation to the increasingly apologetic officers, one thing became crystal clear. This would not be the end of it. It was only the beginning. The warning arrived the next morning. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when I heard the distinct sound of paper being pushed through our mail slot. Curious about Sunday delivery, I walked to the front door and picked up the official-looking envelope that now lay on our welcome mat. The letter inside was printed on heavy cardstock with the neighborhood HOA logo prominently displayed at the top. I felt my chest tighten as I read the formal language. The warning cited me for unsanctioned recreational activity on lawn area and referenced specific bylaw numbers I had never heard of before. According to this document, playing catch with my son violated community standards and could result in fines if the behavior continued. I read the letter twice, unable to believe what I was seeing. The signature at the bottom belonged to Thomas Wilkins, HOA president, but a list of board members printed on the letterhead revealed something that made my blood run cold. Karen Delacourt, third name on the list, HOA board member. "What is that?" my wife Melissa asked, joining me in the entryway. I handed her the letter without comment, watching as her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief to anger. "This is ridiculous," she declared, setting the letter down with more force than necessary. "How can they possibly enforce something like this? We own this property." "Technically, we agreed to abide by HOA regulations when we bought the house," I reminded her, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. "But I do not remember anything prohibiting playing catch in the front yard." "Because there is not," Melissa insisted. "This is targeted harassment, plain and simple." Brandon came downstairs then, his usual weekend enthusiasm notably absent. "Are we in trouble?" he asked quietly, having clearly overheard parts of our conversation. "No, buddy, we are not in trouble," I assured him, though my confidence felt hollow. "Just some confusion with the neighborhood rules, nothing for you to worry about." But the worry had already taken root. Throughout breakfast, Brandon remained subdued, pushing his cereal around the bowl rather than eating it. When he finally spoke again, his words broke my heart. "I am sorry I got us in trouble, Dad." I knelt beside his chair, looking him directly in the eyes. "You did nothing wrong, nothing. This is grown-up stuff and I will handle it. You never have to apologize for spending time with me, okay?" He nodded, but the damage was done. Our perfect Saturday afternoon had been poisoned. And for what? I found myself growing angrier by the minute. Later that day, I discovered our incident had already become neighborhood gossip. The community Facebook page buzzed with veiled references to proper use of front yards and respecting community standards. No one mentioned us by name, but the implication was clear. We had become the latest focus of HOA scrutiny. Monday brought new developments. As I left for work, I noticed Karen standing on her porch, phone pointed directly at my house. When she saw me looking, she made no attempt to hide what she was doing. Instead, she lifted her chin defiantly and continued recording. The documentation continued throughout the week. Karen appeared whenever any of us were outside, taking out trash. Karen was there with her phone, checking the mail. The lens followed our movements. Melissa watering flowers, more recording. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. We began to feel like prisoners in our own home. "She is trying to build a case against us," Melissa observed Thursday evening as we watched Karen photographing our mailbox from across the street. "But for what? Existing." "I think it is about control," I replied, watching the spectacle with growing determination. "Some people need to exert power over others to feel important." The situation was taking a toll on all of us. Melissa had developed a nervous habit of peeking through the blinds before going outside. Brandon had stopped asking to play in the front yard entirely. The tension in our home was palpable, and I knew something had to change. "I am going to the next HOA meeting," I announced at dinner that night. I need to understand exactly what rules we are supposedly breaking and why we are being targeted like this. Do you think that will help? Melissa asked, her skepticism evident. I do not know, I admitted. But doing nothing certainly is not working. We cannot live like this, constantly under surveillance and afraid to enjoy our own property. Brandon looked up from his barely touched dinner. Will they make us move? No, absolutely not, I assured him firmly. This is our home. No one is going to drive us out of it. But as I said those words, I wondered if I could keep that promise. The HOA had significant power, and Karen clearly had influence. I needed more information before I could develop a proper strategy to fight back. The next morning brought another citation. This one claimed our lawn ornaments, a single decorative bird bath, violated aesthetic guidelines. The fine was $150. I took a deep breath and added the letter to a new file I had created. Documentation was going to be key in whatever came next. I studied the HOA bylaws that night, searching for the specific regulations we had supposedly violated. To my frustration, the rules were vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. Recreational activities must not impede the aesthetic harmony of common areas. What did that even mean? And who decided what constituted harmony? One thing became increasingly clear as I prepared for the upcoming HOA meeting. This was not about rules or regulations. This was personal, and I needed to understand why we had become targets before I could effectively fight back. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. on Tuesday in the community center. I arrived 15 minutes early, printouts of the bylaws in hand, prepared to calmly discuss the citations we had received. The room was already half full when I entered, conversations dropping to whispers as heads turned in my direction. I recognized most of my neighbors, but was surprised by how few acknowledged me. People I had chatted with at community barbecues now averted their eyes or offered only the briefest of nods. It was as though I carried some contagious disease they feared catching. I chose a seat near the back, watching as more residents filed in. Karen arrived 5 minutes before the meeting, flanked by two other board members I recognized from the letterhead. Thomas Wilkins, the HOA president, a thin man with perpetually pursed lips, and Diane Hoffman, the treasurer, a severe-looking woman with immaculately styled silver hair. The three of them moved to the front of the room with the confident air of royalty addressing subjects. Karen caught my eye and whispered something to Diane, who glanced back at me with undisguised disdain. Whatever narrative Karen had constructed about me, they had clearly accepted it without question. Thomas called the meeting to order precisely at 7:00 p.m. We moved through standard business first, approving previous minutes, discussing landscaping contracts, and reviewing the community budget. I waited patiently for the open forum portion when residents could bring up concerns. Now we will open the floor for community comments, Thomas announced after 45 minutes of administrative details. Please remember to state your name and address before speaking, and comments are limited to 3 minutes each. I raised my hand immediately, and Thomas had no choice but to acknowledge me. The chair recognizes the gentleman in the back. I stood, papers in hand. Good evening. My name is David Anderson, 1456 Maple Street. I would like to address some recent citations my family has received that seem to be based on extremely subjective interpretations of the bylaws. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Karen sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. Specifically, I continued, we received a warning for playing catch in our front yard, which was described as an unsanctioned recreational activity. I have reviewed the bylaws thoroughly and found no specific prohibition against this activity. Thomas cleared his throat. Mr. Anderson, there are guidelines about maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Yes, I understand that, I replied calmly. But I fail to see how a quiet game of catch between father and son disturbs any kind of harmony. Furthermore, calling the police for such a minor issue seems like an extraordinary overreaction. Karen's face flushed red. Point of order, she interrupted sharply. This is not the appropriate forum for personal grievances. The member is violating decorum rules. I am simply trying to understand, I began, but Thomas cut me off. Mr. Anderson, board decisions regarding violations are not subject to public debate. You received proper notification of the infraction. If you wish to appeal, there is a formal process outlined in Section 6 of the bylaws. I remained standing. I would also like to address what appears to be targeted surveillance of my family. One of your board members has been photographing and recording us daily. Is this official HOA policy? The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Some neighbors looked genuinely surprised by this information. Others studiously examined their hands or the floor. That is enough, Thomas banged his gavel with unnecessary force. You are out of order, Mr. Anderson. This meeting will maintain proper decorum. Before I could respond, Diane smoothly took control. Moving on to new business, the board would like to propose an amendment to our community guidelines. In response to recent concerns about noise and activity levels in residential areas, we suggest implementing designated, quiet zones throughout the neighborhood. With practiced efficiency, she distributed a one-page proposal. As I read through it, my stomach sank. The amendment would effectively ban any recreational activities in front yards. No games, no sports, nothing that could produce unreasonable noise or visual disruption. The definition of unreasonable was, of course, left to the board's discretion. This amendment would protect the peace and property values our community has worked so hard to maintain, Karen added, her voice dripping with false concern. Families could still engage in such activities in designated areas like the community park. The community park was over a mile away, completely impractical for a quick game of catch after dinner. This was not about peace or property values. This was targeted legislation designed specifically to restrict my family. We will now vote on adopting this amendment, Thomas announced, clearly rushing the process. Board members only, please. I watched in disbelief as Karen, Thomas, and Diane all raised their hands in perfect unison. The amendment passed without discussion, effective immediately. Karen turned slightly in her chair, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles as she met my gaze. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur. When it adjourned, I approached several neighbors, hopping to find allies. Most mumbled excuses and hurried away. The few who did speak to me expressed sympathy but made it clear they had no intention of getting involved. You do not want to get on their bad side, one elderly neighbor whispered. Last year, the Johnsons questioned the landscaping contract. Within a month, they had so many citations they ended up selling. Better to keep your head down. I left the community center with one certainty crystallizing in my mind. This was not a random targeting. This was not about rules or community standards. This was a systematic effort to drive us out or break us down. A small group drunk on power had decided to make an example of my family. The question now was what to do about it. As I walked home under the darkening sky, rage competed with determination inside me. They wanted compliance, submission, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I was not going to roll over. I was not going to be intimidated out of my own home. This was war, and I intended to win it. The first new citation arrived Thursday morning, exactly 2 days after the HOA meeting. Improper trash bin placement, $75 fine. According to the attached photographs, our garbage can have been placed 14 inches from the curb instead of the required 12 inches. I measured the distance myself. They were right, by exactly 2 inches. Someone had gone to the trouble of bringing a measuring tape to our trash can before collection day. The pettiness was almost impressive. Saturday brought the second citation. Lawn length violation, $100 fine. Our grass was apparently a 1/4 inch too long in certain areas. The citation included close-up photographs of grass blades with a ruler placed next to them. The dedication to harassment was reaching new levels of absurdity. Monday delivered the third strike. Unauthorized mailbox color, $150 fine. Our mailbox was the standard black color it had been since we moved in 3 years ago. According to the citation, however, The specific shade of black was not on the approved color palette. I would need to repaint it immediately with an approved shade or face additional daily fines. I added each citation to my growing file, taking my own photographs and documentation. The pattern was clear. They were escalating, hitting us with increasingly expensive fines for increasingly trivial violations. At this rate, we would soon be thousands of dollars in debt to the HOA. They can put a lien on the house if we do not pay, Melissa pointed out that evening, her voice tight with worry. I looked it up. They could eventually force foreclosure. It will not come to that, I promised, though the legal reality concerned me too. HOAs had surprising power in these situations. We need to be strategic about this. Brandon had grown increasingly withdrawn as the tension in our house mounted. That night, he came into the kitchen while Melissa and I were discussing our options. Are we going to lose our house? He asked, his voice small and frightened. I immediately knelt to his level. Absolutely not. We are not going anywhere. This is our home. But what if the Karen lady makes us leave? The fact that my 10-year-old son was worrying about housing security infuriated me more than any citation could. That is not going to happen, I assured him. Sometimes adults have disagreements, but we are going to solve this. After Brandon went to bed, I made a decision. If they were going to document our every move, I would do the same. The next day, I installed security cameras covering every angle of our property. Front yard, backyard, sides of the house, nothing would go unobserved. If Karen or any other board member came onto our property, I would have evidence. I also purchased a small body camera to wear whenever I was outside. It might have seemed paranoid, but I needed to protect myself from false accusations. If they claimed I did something wrong, I would have video proof to counter it. For the next week, I made a show of compliance. I measured trash can placement with theatrical precision. I trimmed the lawn every other day. I even repainted the mailbox with an officially approved shade of black, documenting the entire process. The citations slowed but did not stop. Now they found issues with our garden hose being visible, a single weed in the flower bed, a hairline crack in the driveway. Each new violation brought another fine, another layer of financial pressure. Karen continued her surveillance, seemingly emboldened by the board's support. She no longer tried to hide her activities, openly filming whenever any of us were outside. The psychological toll was evident. Melissa developed anxiety about leaving the house. Brandon stopped asking friends to come over, embarrassed by the constant watching. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, my patience and planning paid off. I was working from home when the security system sent an alert to my phone. Someone was at the front of our house. I checked the live feed and could not believe what I was seeing. Karen was on our property, examining our freshly painted mailbox. She looked around furtively, then reached into her pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small tool. With quick, practiced movements, she began loosening the screws holding the mailbox to its post. I watched in stunned disbelief as she deliberately sabotaged our property. After loosening the screws, she carefully positioned the mailbox to look normal but be unstable. Then she took several photographs from different angles before hurrying back to her own property. The entire incident lasted less than 2 minutes. Had I not had cameras installed, I would never have known what happened. The next day, inevitably, would have brought a citation for improperly secured mailbox, with photographic evidence of her own handiwork. I downloaded the footage immediately, backing it up to multiple locations. This was not merely harassment anymore. This was criminal trespassing and vandalism. A line had been crossed. That evening, when Melissa returned from work, I showed her the video. "Oh my God," she whispered, hand covering her mouth. "She is actually setting us up. This is insane." "This is also exactly what we needed," I replied, feeling a grim satisfaction. "Now we have proof that this is targeted harassment." "What are you going to do?" Melissa asked. "Nothing, not yet," I said calmly. "I am going to let her think she won this round. The citation will come tomorrow, and I will quietly pay it just like all the others." "But why? We have evidence now." I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because sometimes you need to lose a few battles to win the war. I am building a case, and the more evidence we have, the stronger our position will be when we finally fight back. The next morning, as predicted, a citation arrived for our unsecured mailbox, complete with photographs Karen had taken of her own sabotage. I added it to the file, paid the fine online, and then tightened the screws properly, all without giving any indication that I knew what had really happened. The game had changed. Karen thought she was hunting us. She did not realize she had become the prey. After weeks of meticulous documentation, I had compiled an impressive dossier. 27 citations for increasingly trivial violations, video evidence of Karen trespassing on our property 3 separate times, copies of the suspiciously targeted HOA amendments, and a detailed timeline of events starting from that first day playing catch. It was time to seek professional help. Through a colleague's recommendation, I scheduled a consultation with Patricia Reynolds, an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. Her office was located downtown, deliberately far from our neighborhood to avoid gossip. Patricia was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s with the confident demeanor of someone who enjoyed a good legal battle. She listened attentively as I laid out our situation, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just absorbing the information. When I finished, she asked to review the evidence I had brought. She studied the security footage with particular interest, replaying the mailbox incident twice before looking up at me with a gleam in her eye. "This is blatant harassment," she concluded, setting down her pen. "And not particularly sophisticated harassment at that. What is interesting here is the pattern of selective enforcement. Have your neighbors received similar citations for these minor issues?" "Not that I am aware of," I replied. "Several have the same mailbox color as ours, for instance, but only we were cited." Patricia nodded. "That is important. HOAs must enforce rules uniformly. When they target specific homeowners, they open themselves up to legal liability." "So we have a case?" I asked, hope rising for the first time in weeks. "You have several cases," Patricia confirmed. "Harassment, selective enforcement, possible discrimination, abuse of power, and in the case of the mailbox tampering, criminal mischief and trespassing." She outlined our options, from filing complaints with state housing authorities to pursuing civil litigation against both the HOA and Karen personally. We decided on a multi-pronged approach, beginning with a strongly worded cease and desist letter. "This puts them on notice," Patricia explained as she drafted the document. "It establishes that you are aware of their actions and prepared to take legal measures. Often, this alone is enough to stop the harassment, as most bullies back down when confronted." The letter was delivered by courier the following day, addressed to the HOA board with copies to each member individually. It detailed the harassment campaign, cited relevant laws being violated, and demanded the immediate cessation of all targeted enforcement. It also required the cancellation of all outstanding fines and the reversal of the recently passed Quiet Zone Amendment. The HOA's response came swiftly and predictably. Thomas Wilkins sent a formal letter dismissing our claims as without merit and threatening additional fines for interfering with HOA operations. Karen escalated her surveillance, now positioned at her window almost constantly. "They are digging in," I told Patricia during our follow-up meeting. "What is our next move?" "Exactly what we anticipated," she replied calmly. "Now we move to Phase 2. Phase 2 involved submitting our evidence to both the State Housing Authority and a local news outlet known for its consumer advocacy reporting. Additionally, Patricia reached out to a housing rights organization that had successfully challenged discriminatory HOA practices in the past. The ripple effects began immediately. A reporter from Channel 8 News contacted me for an interview. Rather than accepting immediately, I consulted with Patricia, who advised a strategic approach. "Share the security footage with them," she suggested. "But hold back on the interview for now. Let the evidence speak for itself first." The story aired the following Tuesday during the evening news. "HOA harassment or rule enforcement?" The segment focused primarily on the security footage showing Karen tampering with our mailbox, followed by the citation we received the next day. The reporter noted that multiple attempts to contact Karen and the HOA board for comment had gone unanswered. The community reaction was immediate and intense. Our phones began ringing with calls from neighbors we had barely spoken to before, all expressing shock and support. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with activity, opinion clearly shifting in our favor as people connected the dots between their own minor run-ins with the board and our systematic targeting. Karen attempted to control the narrative, posting a lengthy defense on the community page claiming she had been checking the stability of our mailbox out of concern for safety, and that the entire situation was being grossly misrepresented. Her explanation rang hollow, especially when confronted with the clear video evidence. Several neighbors came forward with their own stories of intimidation by the board, particularly Karen. What had seemed like isolated incidents now formed a clear pattern of abusive behavior stretching back years. The HOA had systematically targeted anyone who questioned their authority or failed to conform to their arbitrary standards. Patricia called with encouraging news 3 days after the story aired. The housing rights organization has agreed to take your case. They see it as an opportunity to set precedent regarding HOA overreach. That is fantastic, I replied, feeling vindicated after weeks of stress. What happens next? They are filing for an emergency injunction against the HOA to prevent any further enforcement actions against you while the case proceeds. Additionally, they are submitting a formal complaint to the State Housing Authority alleging discriminatory practices. The legal machinery was now in motion, grinding slowly but inexorably toward justice. We received notice that a hearing had been scheduled for the following month to address our allegations against the HOA board. In a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, Karen filed a police report claiming harassment and intimidation on my part. When officers viewed the evidence I had collected, however, they declined to pursue her complaint. Instead, they informed her that she could potentially face charges for trespassing and vandalism based on the security footage. The tide had turned dramatically. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now stopped to chat when they saw us outside. Several apologized for not speaking up sooner, admitting they had feared similar targeting if they showed support. One elderly couple revealed they had nearly lost their home the previous year after accumulated HOA fines for landscaping violations had threatened their fixed income budget. Others shared stories of being bullied into compliance with arbitrary rule interpretations, always with Karen's name featuring prominently in their accounts. What had begun as a personal battle had evolved into a community awakening. People were talking openly about the toxic environment the HOA board had created. Some even began organizing to replace the current board members at the next election. As the hearing date approached, Patricia helped us prepare our testimony and evidence presentation. "This is no longer just about your family," she observed. "This has become about restoring fairness and decency to your entire community." She was right. What had started with a simple game of catch had exposed a deep rot at the heart of our neighborhood governance. And now, finally, we had the chance to cut it out. The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. at the county courthouse. Patricia advised us to dress conservatively and remain calm regardless of provocation. "Let the evidence speak for itself," she counseled. "Your demeanor is being judged as much as your claims." We arrived early to find a surprising number of our neighbors already gathered in the hallway outside the courtroom. Some nodded encouragingly. Others approached to offer support directly. "We are here for you," Mrs. Gallagher, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, told me quietly. It is time someone stood up to them. The HOA contingent arrived precisely at 8:45 a.m. Thomas Wilkins led the group, followed by their attorney, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit. Diane Hoffman walked beside Karen, who kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the crowd of neighbors. The hearing room was not a formal courtroom, but a large conference room with a raised desk for the administrative judge. The setup was less intimidating than a criminal court, but still maintained an air of serious legal proceedings. Judge Alina Mercer entered promptly at 9:00 a.m. She was a middle-aged woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. After introductions and procedural explanations, she turned to Patricia. "Counselor, please present your case." Patricia rose and approached the evidence table. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of targeted harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of power by the Lakeside Homeowners Association Board, particularly board member Karen Delacourt." She methodically laid out our evidence, beginning with the original incident of playing catch and the subsequent 911 call. She presented the timeline of escalating citations, photographs documenting the discrepancy between our property and similarly situated neighbors who received no citations, and affidavits from community members attesting to the pattern of selective enforcement. When she reached the security footage, she turned to address the judge directly. "What you are about to see, Your Honor, transcends mere selective enforcement and ventures into criminal activity." The video played on the courtroom monitor. The footage was crystal clear. Karen approaching our mailbox, looking around furtively, then deliberately loosening the screws before photographing the result. Patricia then displayed the citation we had received the following day for an improperly secured mailbox. Murmurs filled the room. Judge Mercer's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the footage. "We have similar footage from 2 additional incidents," Patricia continued, playing brief clips showing Karen measuring our grass with a ruler and moving our trash bin slightly before photographing it. The HOA's attorney, Martin Graves, presented their defense next. He attempted to frame the citations as routine enforcement of community standards, arguing that the rules applied to everyone equally. As for the security footage, he suggested alternative explanations, claiming Karen had noticed the loose mailbox and was inspecting it rather than tampering with it. His argument sounded hollow even to my untrained ear. Judge Mercer seemed equally unimpressed, interrupting several times to request clarification on points that exposed the weaknesses in their position. The turning point came when Karen herself was called to testify. She took the stand with apparent confidence, smoothing her skirt as she sat down. "Ms. Delacourt," Patricia began during cross-examination, "could you explain why you were on the Andersons' property manipulating their mailbox on April 12th? "As I told our attorney, I noticed it was unstable when walking by. I was attempting to determine if it posed a safety hazard," Karen replied smoothly. "And you did this by loosening the screws further?" Patricia asked incredulously. "I was checking how secure they were," Karen insisted, a slight flush appearing on her neck. "Is it standard HOA procedure to enter private property without permission to inspect for violations?" "In cases of potential safety concerns, yes." Patricia approached with a document. "This is the HOA operations manual you provided during discovery. Could you point to the section that authorizes board members to enter private property without consent?" Karen flipped through the pages with increasing agitation. "It is understood practice." "So not actually in the rules," Patricia clarified. "Just as there is no specific rule prohibiting a father and son from playing catch in their front yard." "That falls under the aesthetic harmony clause," Karen snapped, her composure cracking. "A conveniently vague clause that seems to be applied only to certain homeowners," Patricia observed. "Ms. Delacourt, did you call 911 to report a father and son playing catch?" "There was a disturbance. A disturbance so serious it required emergency services, rather than a simple conversation with your neighbor." Karen's face flushed deeper. They needed to be taught proper respect for the rules. The moment the words left her mouth, she seemed to realize her mistake. A collective intake of breath sounded throughout the room. "Taught respect," Patricia repeated quietly. "So this was not about safety or aesthetic harmony at all. This was about power and control." That is not what I meant, Karen backpedaled frantically. Ms. Delacourt, Judge Mercer interjected, leaning forward. Are you saying you called emergency services to teach the Andersons a lesson? Karen's composure completely disintegrated under the judge's direct questioning. They were flaunting their disregard for our community standards. Someone had to enforce the rules. No one else on the board was willing to take decisive action. Decisive action, the judge repeated slowly, such as tampering with private property and filing false reports. I was protecting our property values, Karen insisted, her voice rising. People like them move in and think they can do whatever they want. Our community has standards. People like them? Patricia asked carefully. What exactly do you mean by that, Ms. Delacourt? Karen seemed to realize she was sinking deeper with every word. I just meant people who do not respect rules. But the damage was done. Her mask had slipped, revealing the prejudice and personal vendetta that had motivated her actions all along. Judge Mercer called for a 15-minute recess, during which Karen huddled intensely with the HOA attorney, their expressions grim. When court resumed, Judge Mercer delivered her ruling with clinical precision. She found in our favor on all counts, dismissing all outstanding fines and censuring the HOA board for selective enforcement and governance violations. She specifically cited Karen's actions as egregious abuses of power and recommended her immediate removal from the board based on ethics violations. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering a mandatory review of all HOA bylaws and enforcement procedures by an independent third party. The court will retain jurisdiction to ensure compliance with these directives. She fixed Karen with a stern gaze. Ms. Delacourt, while this is a civil proceeding, I am referring the evidence of property tampering to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges. You are fortunate the Andersons chose to pursue civil remedies first. As we exited the courtroom, reporters from several local news outlets waited in the hallway. Neighbors gathered around us, offering congratulations and support. Thomas Wilkins and Diane Hoffman slipped away quickly, distancing themselves from Karen, who stood alone near the water fountain, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Patricia handled the media questions with professional skill, focusing on the positive outcome for the community rather than vilifying individuals. Today's decision reaffirms that homeowners associations must operate with transparency, fairness, and respect for all community members, she stated. The Andersons stood up not just for themselves, but for everyone who has felt powerless in the face of arbitrary rule enforcement. As we walked down the courthouse steps, a reporter called out one final question. How does it feel to win against the HOA? I paused, considering my response carefully. Brandon stood beside me, watching with wide eyes. This was never about winning or losing, I replied finally. It was about standing up for what is right, about teaching my son that bullies cannot be allowed to intimidate good people, no matter what authority they claim to have. I placed my hand on Brandon's shoulder, and about showing him that sometimes justice really does prevail. The crowd of neighbors broke into spontaneous applause. In that moment, standing in the bright sunshine with the weight of weeks of stress finally lifting, I felt something I had not experienced since this ordeal began: hope for our community's future. The FOR sale sign appeared in Karen's front yard exactly 9 days after the hearing. There was no fanfare, no neighborhood announcement. The sign simply materialized overnight, as quiet and sudden as her departure would prove to be. Neighbors reported seeing moving trucks 3 weeks later, loading furniture and boxes under Karen's tight-lipped supervision. She spoke to no one, acknowledged no one. By evening, the house stood empty, window blinds drawn like closed eyes. She never even said goodbye, Mrs. Gallagher commented when we passed her walking her dog. Not that anyone expected her to, I suppose. The HOA board underwent a complete transformation in the wake of the hearing. Thomas Wilkins resigned his position as president, citing personal reasons in a terse email to the community. Diane Hoffman followed suit a week later. With 3 vacancies to fill, an emergency election was called. To my surprise, several neighbors approached me about running for the board. I declined politely. I think I have had enough HOA politics for a lifetime, I explained. But I would be happy to help the new board review and revise the bylaws. The newly elected board members were a welcome change from their predecessors. James Chen, a retired civil engineer, took over as president with a promise of transparency and common sense. Sarah Williams, a local teacher, and Michael Ockhaffer, a small business owner, rounded out the leadership with fresh perspectives and community-focused priorities. Their first official act was to rescind the Quiet Zone Amendment. Their second was to commission a complete review of all HOA rules and enforcement procedures, with input welcomed from all community members. We want to preserve what makes our neighborhood special without micromanaging how people enjoy their own properties, James announced at their first meeting. The rules should protect, not punish. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Neighbors who had previously hurried between house and car now lingered to chat. Weekend cookouts and impromptu gatherings became common sights. Children played freely in front yards without parents nervously checking for approaching board members. Our family felt the shift perhaps more profoundly than most. The constant anxiety that had shadowed us for months gradually lifted. Melissa no longer tensed when the mail arrived. Brandon's friends returned for visits, filling our home with the noise and energy of happy children. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months after the hearing, Brandon approached me as I was reading on the porch. "Dad," he asked hesitantly, "could we play catch out here in the front yard?" The question struck me like a physical blow. I had not realized until that moment how deeply the trauma of our ordeal had affected him. That something as simple and innocent as playing catch with his father had become associated with fear and conflict. "Absolutely," I replied, setting aside my book immediately. "Let me get the gloves." We took our positions on the lawn, just as we had that fateful day months earlier. The first few throws were tentative, Brandon glancing nervously toward the street. "It is okay, buddy," I assured him. "We are not doing anything wrong, we never were." Gradually, his throws became more confident, his smile more genuine. A few neighbors walked by, offering friendly waves instead of suspicious glares. Mrs. Wilson from next door actually stopped to compliment Brandon's catching technique. As we played, I reflected on the long journey we had taken. The stress, the anger, the fear, all because one person had decided to weaponize rules against us. But we had survived. More than that, we had helped transform our community into something better. "Dad," Brandon's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Do you think we could invite some of the other kids to play too? Maybe make it a regular thing?" I caught the ball he had just thrown and smiled. "That sounds like a great idea. This yard was meant for living, not just looking at." The following weekend, 6 neighborhood children joined us for an informal baseball clinic in our front yard. The weekend after that, the group had doubled. Soon, Saturday mornings in our yard became a neighborhood tradition, with parents stopping by with coffee and conversation while their children learned the fundamentals of America's pastime. The irony was not lost on me. What Karen had tried so desperately to prevent had become the very thing that brought our community together. Her crusade to isolate us had instead created new connections, new friendships. One evening, as Melissa and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, she took my hand in hers. "You know, in a weird way, we almost owe Karen a thank you." I raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Before all this happened, we barely knew our neighbors," she explained. "We were just houses next to each other, not a community. Now look at us. We are actually living here, not just existing." She was right. Through standing up against bullying and unfairness, we had helped forge something valuable, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. Our home was truly our own again. Our street was a neighborhood again, and the echo of Karen's anger had faded, replaced by the sound of children's laughter and the satisfying smack of a baseball landing in a well-worn glove. Some battles are worth fighting, not just for the victory, but for the world you create in their aftermath. As I watched Brandon demonstrate a proper throwing technique to the youngest children in our growing Saturday group, I knew with absolute certainty that this had been one of them.